Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be covering a deck from the 2005 format. Now, typically we haven't done a whole lot of decks from the 2005 format, and that's something over the course of this year I want to change a little bit because I think there's a lot of really, I'm going to say, fun decks from the 2005 format, and I think there's a lot of really interesting matchups in the 2005 format. So today we're going to cover what I consider to be one of the most original sort of strategies in the Pokemon trading card game. And something I don't think we've seen in more modern times here, but it's going to be a Victreebel-Weezing deck. Now, essentially, the combination for the deck is we are going to use Weezing's Liability to put damage counters on the defending Pokemon until it has 10 damage or 10 health remaining. Weezing's going to do 70 damage to itself, which is going to knock out Weezing. Now we're going to combo that with Victreebel and Acid Sampler, which is going to put one damage counter on each defending Pokemon between turns. So the combo is you bring up Weezing, you use Liability, put the defending Pokemon down to 10 HP, you knock Weezing out. Once Weezing's knocked out, you promote Victreebel, that Acid Sampler kicks in, doing that last 10 damage to knock out the defending Pokemon. So essentially, Weezing is a one-hit knockout on anything. There is going to be some things that would prevent effects and things like that would get around it, but in competitive play, there's almost nothing that'll actually prevent this combination. Now, this seems incredibly good, but it has a lot of weaknesses. The biggest one being is that your opponent essentially gets a free turn-in, because essentially you do Weezing, you knock out. So basically, they're going to hit you or do whatever on their turn. You bring up Weezing, do Liability, knock it out when you bring up Victreebel, and then they're going to get to hit you again. So essentially, you go 1-for-1, and then they get a free attack in after that. This makes Weezing not a. You can't just build a deck around Weezing and go like 4-4 Weezing. Because of that free hit, essentially your opponent's always going to come out ahead. In the long run on that. But what Weezing does a very good job at, it does incredibly well against either EX decks, where you're, instead of going 1-for-1, you're going 1-for-2, where essentially you're giving up one prize, but you're taking two prizes. Or two, it does really well against decks that have to invest a lot of effort into a single Pokemon. Like earlier this week, I was playing a game against a Venusaur EX deck in this format, and it was a very cool strategy. It was a Parasect to search out energy, and then Venusaur EX to move it around and just be a really big tank and hard hitter. But essentially, he brings up Venusaur EX, hits me, he puts 5 energy on it, knocks something out. I bring up Weezing, use Liability, knock out the Venusaur EX, and essentially I gave up that one Weezing, and he gave up a Venusaur EX, which was a stage 2, had a lot of investment getting the Venusaur EX out, and then 5 energy on top of that. On top of that, I traded 1 prize for 2. I came out way ahead in that. The deck struggles against decks that are very self-replacing. So against things like sometimes like Dark Tyranitar in 2006 for example, or 2005 for example, where they can just slam Tyranitar after Tyranitar after Tyranitar at you. The deck can be very weak against that sort of strategy. Or something like Rocklock, where essentially you're going 1-for-1. It can be weaker in those sort of strategies too. It's a lot better against decks that require more investment in Pokemon. The advantage in the 2005 format that I like about this deck is a lot of the top decks are either going to be very EX heavy, like Metacham EX or ZRE, Turn 2 Zapdos, or they're going to be grass weak, like Nidoqueen. I want to move that around. So against a lot of the better decks in the format, it actually does very well against. It's going to struggle, like I said, against more decks like Rocklock. Ludicargo is a tougher matchup. Dark Tyranitar. Those are going to be tougher matchups, but it'll do well against a lot of the better decks in the format. So let's go ahead and just kind of break the cards down here. We went with 3 Dunsparce, 1 Jirachi. Dunsparce we've covered a lot in the 2004 format. You got that strike and run. Grab 3 basics out of your deck. And then 1 copy of Jirachi with that Wishing Star to be able to grab a card out of the top 5. You see this 3-1 or 4-1 more commonly in the 2005 format and the 2006 format. 2006, you'll see a lot of decks just play that Transceiver Mentor Engine because it's just stronger, and then play 1 or 2 Jirachi, and then they'll just retreat back to the Jirachi. In this format, you'll usually see that 3 or 4 Dunsparce and that Jirachi because it's harder to set up your bench this way, or in this format. I will say, yeah, so this is honestly, I think, about the best way to do it. And then, of course, you can grab Dunsparce, and then if you have open Dunsparce with a dead hand, you can grab Jirachi off of that and then switch into the Jirachi. We went with the 3-2-3 Victreebel. Went with a little bit smaller Victreebel line, and then we went with a higher Pokemon Retriever count. There's a lot of decks in this format that I feel can do this. Just playing 2 copies of Retriever and then like a 3-2-3 over a larger like 4-3-4 or something like that. 2 Coughing, 2 Wheezing. This was a deck at the time, but I feel one of the biggest mistakes that players made is a lot of the lists that I saw were like 4-4 Wheezing or like, 3-3 Wheezing, and I don't. You just can't go heavy liability. Like, liability is not always like the main strategy of the deck. It's just something that you always threaten, you always have available to you is that Wheezing. 2-1-2 Pidgeot. Pidgeot's just too good to play in this format. The only real counter to it, you don't have Lunarock to deal with, so the only real counter to it is going to be Battle Frontier. Then, of course, Desert Ruins already plays so well into this deck. Supporters, we play Force Helios Network. Just to help us set up, 3 copies of Copycat. Copycat is also really good in this format. Decks still rely very heavily on Steven's advice, and then you have decks like Metacham EX, which will routinely try to get you to a low hand size and themselves to a higher hand size. Things like Copycat are just very good in that, against that. And I think also when they play some decks like Turn 2 Cham, sometimes decks like ZRE can get by with very small benches, and things like Copycat can just be more consistent than things like Steven's advice. 3 Rockets Admin, especially, I think Rockets Admin is very good, and on top of that, it's in a format where it's in a deck where you're going to be giving up prizes along the way, so you're going to get more mileage out of it than you might in other decks as well. The one downside in this format versus like 2006, for example, is you really don't have a good way to control Pidgeot. So if your opponent does play Pidgeot, and you Rockets Admin, even to 1 or 2 cards, and they have access to Quick Search, which you really don't have a whole lot of good ways to stop, it's very hard for you to actually do anything about that. It's very hard to lock your opponent out of a game like in 2006. Admins are a much bigger deal in my opinion. To Steven's advice, a lot of decks in the format rely on heavy benches or big benches. There's not a whole lot of cards in the format that punish you for putting down big benches. There's no Dusknoir, there's no Giant Stump or anything like that. So it's good to get those draws in. 1 copy of Mr. Briny's Compassion. Now this is something that I think in 2005 was largely missed in more modern versions of the format play. Is you'll see a lot of 1 or 2 Briny's Compassions in decks that can incorporate it, and then you see a lot of very heavy counts of VS Seeker. And I think VS Seeker in 2005 and 2006 saw very little play, but there's a lot of decks in 2005 in particular because, in my opinion, there's more space or more room in 2005 than you have in 2006 for techs. I think a lot of decks can play that 1 Briny's and then 3 or 4 VS Seeker. And VS Seeker is, you just play so many different supporters. Right here we have 5 different supporters that VS Seeker just gives you a ton of versatility. And a lot of matchups, or at least the matchups you're going to need it in, you're going to want to save the VS Seekers for Mr. Briny's Compassion. But there's also going to be situations where you might need a Stevens, an Admin, a Copycat, or even just a regular Helios Network to search out a Pokemon. But the big reason this Briny's is so strong in this format is there is considerably less one-hit knockouts in this format. So you're going to see a lot of decks that have to 2-shot. This deck has to 2-shot. Usually Ludi Cargo, you can set up your bench where they have to 2-shot. Nidoqueen has to 2-shot. Dragtro can usually 1-shot, but you can definitely force them into situations, especially later on in the game if they don't have a whole lot of dark energies or R energies left, or they have to two-shot. And in those sort of situations, to basically, Mr. Briney's Compassion is just basically says, ignore your opponent's last turn, and you can repeat that up to 4 times in a game is just so incredibly strong. 4 copies of Rare Candy. This format in particular, it is just so crucial that you hit the first Pidgeot. If your opponent has Pidgeot and you don't hit it a turn or two behind them, you're going to really struggle to win that game. Also great to pull Victreebels out of nowhere. And then once again, it combos with that Briney's Compassion where we can pick a Victreebel up and then slam it back down instantly. 3 VS Seeker, which we talked about already, just such a great card. Looking back, I can't believe how underplayed this card was. I think players were just so worried about opening with dead hands, and then like a VS Seeker was not a consistency card in the early stages of the game that it just didn't see play, but it offers so much versatility. As soon as you have a single supporter, it becomes a live card. So the deck, it just offers so much versatility. It's such a good card to play. 2 copies of Pokemon Retriever. This does a couple of different things. It allows us to have multiple Victreebels. It also allows us to throw Weezings back. So if those games where we do end up ahead in prizes, we can just do that liability until we win. But generally, this is a deck, and one of the weaknesses of the deck in general is it's very hard to play from behind it. If your opponent goes up 3 quick prizes, it's very hard to then go ahead and give up another free prize to them using a liability. So Retriever is just an all-around good card. I do play 1 copy of Swoop Teleporter in this. This serves a couple of different purposes, but essentially one of the bigger decks in the format, especially at the time, was Medicham EX, and your opponent is able to just POW something in the active spot and lock it there, like let's say a Dunsparce or something. Swoop gives us a little bit more consistency there, where we could swoop that Dunsparce into a Coughing, evolve it into a Weezing, and then liability from there. Or just at the start of the game, if we open Dunsparce, we can go strike and run, switch to like let's say a Jirachi, keep the energy into the Dunsparce, and then just swoop it out in the later stages of the game. Swoop just offers a lot of versatility for a very little investment. And I'm going to say I think Swoop Teleporter was one of the most underrated cards in both 2005 and 2006, either just as a one-of tech or more of a bigger part of the deck, like 2 or 3 copies like you see in Bomb Tar, for example. But the card is just so absolutely good. A lot of players do not play it in decks outside of like Jirachi Swoop decks, and I just think that was such a massive mistake at the time. I think the VS Seeker and the Swoop Teleporter were well underplayed in those formats. 4 copies of Desert Ruins. Not only does that offer us a Battle Frontier counter, it's just so good in this format with so many big decks like Medicham and ZRE playing Desert Ruins, and then against decks like Nidoqueen, for example, it's really good to, if you can get that first Desert Ruins down, to then make the Desert Ruins in their deck be dead cards. Greater chance they'll draw them off of late game Rockets admins. Energy for the deck. We do play a total of 12 energy here. Now, this may seem really low, but you got to remember that we are going to be trading prizes very quickly with liability, and that only requires 1. And then we're going to constantly be trying to pick up that Victreebel with Mr. Briney's Compassion to conserve some energy there as well. So we just go with 4 double rainbow energies. Works really well. Not only Pidgeot for clutch, Victreebel for acid, Scramble energy. Once again, very common that we might be down in prizes. Get a lot of versatility out of Scramble energy. And I also want to point out a couple of things with Scramble energy too, where if we're playing against like a Nidoqueen deck, for example, they knock something out, we bring up Victreebel, Nidoqueen takes 10, Scramble, Acid, hit them for 100, and then 10 damage in between turns will knock out the Nidoqueen. That's one of the advantages, I think, of this deck, is I do feel like the Nidoqueen matchup is pretty solid, and Nidoqueen and Dragtrode are probably the 2 best decks in the format by probably a pretty decent margin. So being able to have solid matchups against Nidoqueen and Dragtrode, I'm relying very heavily on EXs being an okay matchup as well, is a big plus for the deck in my opinion. And then, of course, just 6 grass energies to round out our lineup. It's very common in the later stages of the game. You might be able to power up a Victreebel without needing the benefit of double energies like Scramble or double rainbow energies, and being able to use that acid for 50. Last thing I really want to mention about the deck is both that acid and clutch have that ability to stop your opponent from retreating. These can be very annoying things for your opponent as well when they are playing the game. So other than that, that's going to go ahead and wrap up the deck profile here. I think the deck is a lot of fun to play. It was probably underplayed in 2005. I'm not gonna say it was like I'm not gonna say it's one of the best decks. I'm not gonna say it's the best deck in the format, but I do feel like it's probably a higher tier 2 deck that could compete really well against a lot of the higher tier 1 decks. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the deck profile, and I hope to see you in the next video.